Babylon, June 323 BC. The air is thick with humidity, heavy with the scent of jasmine from the legendary Hanging Gardens. But the grand city's usual revelry has been replaced by a silence so profound it feels like a shroud. Inside Nebuchadnezzar II's palace, a legend is dying. He is Alexander III of Macedon, Alexander the Great. He is the man who in just 12 years forged an empire stretching from Greece to the plains of India. He conquered Persia, unified the East and West, and was worshipped as a god-king during his own lifetime. He had survived Illyrian spears, Persian arrows, an Indian chieftain's mace, and the paranoia of his inner circle. Simply put, he was the unconquered king. Yet here, in the heart of Babylon, his greatest prize, he lay defeated. The victor was not an enemy army, but an unseen foe. He was only 32 years old. The official story speaks of a fever, a sudden illness caused by exhaustion and excessive celebration, but the symptoms recorded by his frightened staff were bizarre. A searing pain, a fever that refused to break, and worst of all, 6 days after he was officially declared dead, his body showed no sign of decay. His followers claimed it was a miracle, proof of his divinity. But history is rarely a miracle. It is usually a conspiracy, a failure, or a dark secret. For over 2 millennia, the world has asked, what truly killed Alexander the Great? Was it a natural, merciless end brought by the fevers of Babylon? Or was the ultimate price of his ambition paid with a poisoned cup of wine, handed to him by the very men he had raised to power? We are about to dive into history's greatest cold case. We will analyze the medical evidence, consult the ancient conspirators, and present a shocking modern theory that could finally solve the mystery of Alexander's final days. This is the life, the death, and the final enduring mystery of the Conqueror. To understand Alexander's death, we must first understand his life, a life fueled by a singular, burning ambition. He was born in Pella, the capital of Macedon, in 356 BC. His father was Philip II, a brilliant, ruthless king who transformed Macedon from a backwater into the dominant military power of Greece. His mother, Olympias, was a fiery, intensely religious woman who spread the myth that Alexander was not Philip's son, but the son of Zeus himself. This complex heritage, the strategic genius of a king, and the divine claim of a zealot forged a man who believed there was no limit to his destiny. From the ages of 13 to 16, Alexander's tutor was Aristotle, arguably the greatest intellectual mind of the age. Aristotle instilled in him a love of Homer's Iliad, which Alexander carried everywhere, and a fascination with science, geography, and exploration. This education gave the young prince a unique worldview. He was a king who commanded armies, and a scholar who mapped the world he conquered. But the true making of the Conqueror began in 336 BC, when Philip II was assassinated. Alexander, just 20 years old, seized the throne with terrifying speed and ruthlessness. He secured Macedon, crushed the rebellious Greek city-states, destroying Thebes completely as a warning, and declared his intention to finish his father's dream, the invasion of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. In 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont. What followed was a military campaign of unprecedented scale and speed. At the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, Alexander shattered the Darius III's massive army, effectively ending the Persian Empire. He marched on, claiming the ancient capitals of Susa, Persepolis, and Pasargadae. He looted the treasuries of the great kings, fundamentally changing the nature of the Greek economy. He wasn't just conquering, he was Hellenizing the world. He founded dozens of cities named Alexandria, from Egypt to Afghanistan, planting Greek culture, language, and commerce across continents. The stories of his early conquests are legendary. The Gordian knot he cut with his sword, fulfilling the prophecy that he would rule all of Asia. The siege of Tyre, where he built a massive causeway to connect the island city to the mainland, a feat of engineering considered impossible. The founding of Alexandria in Egypt, which would become the intellectual heart of the ancient world. By the time he turned east again, heading into modern-day Afghanistan and then across the Hindu Kush into India, Alexander believed his empire would only stop when he reached Oceanus, the great outer sea, the mythical end of the world. He was no longer just a king. His power was absolute, his will unquestioned, and his self-image, reinforced by his mother and his own success, was fully divine. He demanded prostration, proskynesis, a practice deeply offensive to his Macedonian veterans. But the vastness of the empire, the intoxication of power, and the sheer physical toll of constant war were about to expose the deep and dangerous cracks in his foundation. The man who conquered the world was slowly losing control of his inner world. The further Alexander marched, the greater the distance grew between the god-king and his tired, homesick Macedonian soldiers. The constant travel, the brutal climate, and the unforgiving battles eroded their loyalty, breeding resentment and suspicion. The pressure cooker of prolonged warfare and absolute power began to expose Alexander's darker side: paranoia, extreme cruelty, and dangerous impulsiveness, often fueled by wine. One of the most famous and chilling examples occurred in 328 BC, the murder of Clitus the Black. Clitus was a veteran, a childhood friend, and the man who had famously saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus. During a drunken banquet in Samarkand, Clitus dared to challenge Alexander's increasing Persian affectations and his claims of divinity. Clitus suggested that Alexander was insulting his father, Philip, and the men who had truly built the Macedonian Empire. In a blind rage, Alexander ignored the pleas of his friends, seized a spear, and plunged it into Clitus's heart. The next day, sober and devastated, Alexander was consumed by grief. But the act was done. The king had killed his loyal brother-in-arms over a drunken argument about glory. The message was clear. Dissent was fatal, regardless of loyalty. This was followed by other purges. The execution of his brilliant historian Callisthenes for refusing to perform proskynesis, prostration. Callisthenes was the nephew of Aristotle, and his death was a deliberate rejection of his former teacher's influence. the assassination of Parmenion, his most trusted general, and the execution of Parmenion's son, Philotas, on suspicion of conspiracy. This brutal act removed the most seasoned military command from the empire, leaving Alexander surrounded by younger, less experienced men and more desperate rivals. The climax of this political strife came in 326 BC in India. After a grueling campaign and a devastating victory against King Porus at the Hydaspes River, Alexander wanted to push further east to the Ganges. His troops had had enough. The mutiny at Ciphasis River was a moment of true humiliation. Standing on the banks of the Bias River, the Macedonian veterans simply refused to go further. They cited exhaustion, endless marching, and the terrible monsoon rains. For 3 days, Alexander sulked in his tent, threatening to continue alone. But his will, for the first and only time, was broken by his own men. He was forced to turn back. This forced retreat damaged Alexander's psyche. He spent the long journey back exacting vengeance and engaging in reckless, unnecessary battles. During the siege of Multan, he was severely wounded by an arrow in his chest and lung, an injury that would cause him intermittent pain and weakness for the rest of his short life. By 323 BC, Alexander was back in Babylon, the ancient city he intended to make the capital of his world empire. He was exhausted, psychologically strained, deeply wounded, and increasingly reliant on excessive alcohol consumption to cope with the pain and isolation of his absolute power. He had conquered the world, but he was losing the war against himself. The stage was set for his downfall.
The events of the final 11 days are chronicled in conflicting but chilling detail by ancient sources, notably the royal diaries, ephemeroids, and later historians like Arrian and Plutarch. The fatal decline began on the evening of May 29, 323 BC. Alexander, deep in planning a new campaign against Arabia, was convinced by a nobleman named Medius of Larissa to attend a lavish drinking party. Alexander was a known heavy drinker, but this night was legendary, even by his standards. The drinking bout. Accounts claim that Alexander drank repeatedly from a phyali, a golden cup dedicated to Heracles, his mythical ancestor. One story suggests he suddenly collapsed after draining a massive bowl of unmixed wine, a highly potent and dangerous act. The onset. The collapse was described not as simple intoxication, but as an immediate, searing pain. He cried out as if he had been struck with a spear in the liver. This pain was followed by a raging fever that quickly consumed his body. The next 10 days were a living nightmare, meticulously documented in the style of a contemporary medical horror story. Day 2, the fever intensifies. Alexander attempts to carry out his daily duties, presiding over sacrifices and planning, but the effort is too great. He is forced to retire to his bed. Day 3 to 5, the fever rages. He suffers from extreme thirst and is constantly plagued by chills and sweats. His staff reports increasing difficulty in moving and a relentless, exhausting pain, especially in the abdomen. Day 6 to 8, the symptoms worsen into what appears to be progressive paralysis. Alexander loses the ability to walk. The military commanders are summoned, now in a state of growing panic, knowing that a king's death meant chaos and civil war. Day 9, 10, Alexander has lost the ability to speak. He can only communicate by small hand and head movements. A rumor sweeps Babylon that the king is already dead. The Macedonian veterans, the tough, emotional core of his army, demand to see their general one last time. The silent procession. The most heartbreaking scene in the ancient accounts is the procession. The generals carry the paralyzed, silent king on his bed out into the courtyard. His rough, sunburnt soldiers, the men who had followed him through fire and sand, filed past him one by one. They could not speak to him, and he could not speak to them, but Alexander, through the haze of his fever, struggled to raise his head and offer a silent greeting with his eyes to each man. It was a silent, agonizing farewell between a general and his army. Day 11, June 10th, 11th, 323 BC. Alexander the Great dies in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. The world had lost its conqueror, but the mystery was just begun. The 6-day miracle. Here is the crucial, chilling detail that has baffled historians and doctors for millennia. According to several sources, Alexander's body, for 6 days, did not begin to decompose. In the sweltering, humid heat of a Mesopotamian summer, putrefaction should have set in within hours. Yet Plutarch reports that Alexander's body, although it lay without special care in places that were moist and stifling, showed no sign of such a destructive influence, but remained pure and fresh. Was this proof of his divinity, as many claimed, or was it the ultimate clue in history's greatest murder mystery?
In the absence of a modern autopsy, historians and doctors have performed a retrodiagnosis, attempting to match Alexander's symptoms to known diseases of the ancient world. The first major camp argues that the king succumbed to a natural infectious end. Babylon was a city built on the Euphrates, a place of canals, marshes, and grand feasts, a perfect breeding ground for disease. The leading infectious disease theory is typhoid fever, Salmonella typhi. This bacterial infection is common in areas with poor sanitation and contaminated food or water, a certainty in ancient Babylon. The evidence: persistent high fever. Typhoid is characterized by a high fever that can last for weeks, a perfect match for Alexander's 11-day illness. Abdominal pain. Accounts mention a searing abdominal pain. Typhoid can cause severe gut inflammation and even perforation. Slow decline. The 11-day progression, starting with fever and thirst, leading to severe weakness, is consistent with the course of untreated typhoid. The counter-evidence, the flaw. While typhoid explains the fever and the pain, it fails to fully account for the profound, total paralysis, the loss of speech and movement, which Alexander suffered. Furthermore, it does not explain the complete lack of decomposition for 6 days. Another strong contender, given the location in a marshy region, is malaria, Plasmodium falciparum. The evidence: cyclical fever and chills. Early accounts suggest Alexander's fever was initially intermittent, which is a key signature of malaria. Commonality in Babylon. The area was notorious for this disease, and the king was likely constantly exposed to it. The counter-evidence, the flaw. While malaria is typically a fast-acting, brutal killer, often causing delirium, Alexander, however, was reported to be mentally coherent and rational right up until his death, communicating through his eyes. The symptoms do not align perfectly. Beyond the specific diseases, modern doctors stress Alexander's physical state. 10 years of constant, brutal campaigning, multiple severe wounds, including the lung injury and chronic heavy alcohol abuse, had utterly exhausted his system. His heavy drinking may have caused acute pancreatitis, characterized by searing abdominal pain, or delirium tremens during withdrawal, leading to severe dehydration and seizures. Any infectious disease would have been exponentially more deadly in a body weakened by years of military life and alcohol dependency. The conclusion of the pathogen plot. A natural death by infectious disease is plausible, but it is incomplete. It explains the fever and the pain, but it leaves two crucial questions unanswered. Why the profound, total paralysis, and why did the body refuse to rot? To answer these questions, we must turn to the darkest theory, assassination.
The possibility of poisoning was rampant in the Macedonian court. Where there is absolute power, there is always absolute conspiracy. Alexander had ruled for 12 years by the sword, and his paranoia was deserved. He had made many enemies, powerful men who feared that their own names might be next on the king's death list. The prime suspect for orchestrating Alexander's death was Antipater, the aged and loyal general whom Alexander had left as regent of Macedon and Greece. The motive: Alexander's relationship with Antipater had soured dramatically. The king had received multiple complaints of Antipater's tyrannical behavior and greed. Shortly before falling ill, Alexander had summoned Antipater to Babylon, a meeting many, including Antipater himself, took as a death sentence. Antipater did not travel alone. He sent his son Cassander, who was humiliated by Alexander in court, and crucially, another son, Iollas, who served as Alexander's personal royal cupbearer, the perfect infiltration. Ancient accounts, like that of Curtius Rufus, point the finger directly at Iollas, acting on the orders of his father, Antipater. The poison was allegedly administered during the notorious drinking bout with Medius. But what poison could kill a man so slowly, taking 11 agonizing days while causing paralysis and fever? The white hellebore theory, the most compelling candidate proposed by modern toxicologists, is Veratrum album, known as white hellebore. This plant was known to the ancient Greeks. The evidence: delayed action. Hellebore is not an instant killer. When mixed with wine, it causes a severe, drawn-out poisoning. Symptoms match. Hellebore poisoning often begins with severe epigastric or abdominal pain and vomiting, consistent with the spear-like pain Alexander felt. It then progresses to bradycardia, a dangerously slow heart rate, muscle tremors, and extreme weakness. The wine connection. The poison would have been easy to conceal in the large quantity of wine Alexander consumed at the banquet, administered discreetly by Iollas, the cupbearer. The conclusion of the conspiracy plot. The poisoning theory perfectly explains the political motive, the opportunity, the cupbearer, and the delayed, agonizing symptoms. It satisfies the dramatic instinct that the greatest conqueror in history must have been brought down by human treachery. But even the hellebore theory struggles with the final bizarre piece of evidence: the 6 days without decay.
In recent years, a groundbreaking medical theory has emerged, one that finally reconciles the king's strange symptoms with the terrifying final clue of the undecaying body. The theory, proposed by Dr. Catherine Hall, a clinical lecturer at the Dunedin School of Medicine in New Zealand, is that Alexander the Great was a victim of Guillain-Barré syndrome, GBS. GBS is a rare, acute autoimmune disorder. It is typically triggered by a simple bacterial infection, like Campylobacter pylori, which causes food poisoning and diarrhea. The mechanism: in GBS, the immune system, in its zeal to fight the initial infection, mistakenly attacks the body's own peripheral nerve linings. This destroys the insulation around the nerves,
causing progressive symmetrical paralysis that starts in the feet and moves upward. The evidence, the perfect match. The paralysis. GBS explains why Alexander went from feverish to completely paralyzed, unable to move or speak, yet remained fully mentally lucid. His mind was trapped inside a paralyzed body. The abdominal pain. The initial infection that triggers GBS often causes diarrhea and severe abdominal distress, matching the king's first symptoms. This leads us to the most horrifying conclusion. Alexander's body did not decay for 6 days because he was not actually dead when he was declared so. GBS can cause paralysis of the respiratory muscles. The patient's breathing becomes extremely shallow, so slight that ancient physicians who relied on simple visual cues and not on taking a pulse would have easily missed it. The diagnosis error. Lying paralyzed, unable to speak, with minimal visible breathing, Alexander would have been declared dead in the sweltering Babylonian heat. The non-decay clue. His near-invisible breathing combined with the paralysis would have put him into a state of hypothermia, a drop in body temperature, and extremely low blood pressure. A cold, seemingly lifeless body would slow the rate of decomposition, supporting the accounts of the pure and fresh king. In essence, the greatest tragedy of Alexander's life may not have been an assassination, but a false diagnosis, pseudo-thanatos, a terrifying irony where the man who claimed to be a god was alive when his funeral preparations began. So what is the final verdict? The poisoning theory is dramatically satisfying, attributing the death to a conspiracy of betrayed men. The GBS theory is medically compelling, explaining the most baffling symptoms and the non-decaying body. Perhaps the final heartbreaking truth is a synthesis of the two. Alexander, weakened by the typhoid-like infection or GBS trigger and years of alcohol abuse, was not killed by a single dose of poison, but by the relentless cumulative toll of his own boundless ambition. His body simply failed under the strain of being both a god and a man. Alexander's death shattered the ancient world. With his final whispered answer to the question of who should rule, to the strongest, he unleashed the wars of the Diadochi. His generals tore his colossal empire apart, fighting for decades over the remains. The unified world Alexander envisioned dissolved into smaller, warring Hellenistic kingdoms. Alexander the Great, the conqueror of the world, may have died alone and paralyzed, trapped inside his own body, but his legacy of Hellenism endured, shaping the Mediterranean and the Near East for centuries. The true mystery of his death is not how he died, but what a powerful humanizing lesson his end provides. That no ambition, no empire, and no man, no matter how great, is immune to the frailty of the human body. The man who could not be defeated in battle was defeated at last by a secret that lay hidden within his own veins.